I never imagined that my life would take such a dramatic turn, but looking back, I can see how every moment led me to where I am today. 7 years ago, I was unjustly fired from my job as a caregiver, accused of theft I didn't commit. Little did I know that this devastating event would set me on a path that would eventually bring me face to face with my former boss at a major event, leaving him utterly bewildered by my transformation. Back then, I was living in a modest house in the suburbs with my parents and younger siblings. I can still vividly remember the feel of damp laundry in my hands as I hung it to dry, my mind wandering to dreams of a different life. As I went about my daily chores, doing laundry, preparing lunch, I couldn't help but yearn for something more. I dreamed of a life where I could provide better for my family, and yes, even a life where I could focus on my own aspirations. Those moments of reflection were bittersweet, like a tug of war in my heart. On one side was the reality of my humble beginnings, the familiar weight of financial struggle that so many of us know all too well. On the other was this burning desire to do something more meaningful, to climb the ladder and prove to myself and the world that I was capable of so much more. I remember one day in particular, as clear as if it were yesterday. I was hanging laundry when my phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me out of my daydreams. It was my friend Angela, her voice bubbling with excitement and anticipation. Angela was a caregiver for the elderly, someone I'd always admired for her dedication and compassion. She told me she was moving to another city due to her husband's promotion, which meant she had to leave her job. I can still hear her words, "Erin, you've always wanted a stable job, right? I'm moving next week, and I was wondering if you could take over for me?" Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt a flutter of excitement in my chest. But along with that excitement came a wave of doubt and insecurity. With my hands still damp from the laundry, I clutched the phone and heard myself saying, "But Angela, I've never worked as a professional caregiver before." I could hear the uncertainty in my voice, that little quiver that betrays our deepest fears. But Angela, bless her heart, didn't let me wallow in self-doubt for long. She quickly cut me off, her voice firm but kind. She reminded me of how I'd been taking care of my grandparents, how I'd helped our sick neighbor. "You have a gift for caring for others, Erin," she said, "and that's all that matters. Plus, I'll support you with everything you need to know." Her words were like a warm embrace, chasing away my doubts and filling me with a newfound confidence. The next day, bolstered by Angela's encouragement, I made the decision to go for an interview at the Williams house. I remember standing in front of my wardrobe, my hands shaking slightly as I picked out my best outfit. It wasn't anything fancy, mind you, just a simple, clean ensemble that I hoped would make a good impression. As Angela and I approached the Williams mansion, I felt a mix of nerves and hope bubbling up inside me. The house was enormous, elegantly decorated in a way that made me acutely aware of the vast difference between their world and mine. It was like stepping into one of those fancy homes you see in magazines, the kind you flip through at the doctor's office, dreaming of a life that seems just out of reach. When we arrived, we were greeted by Steve Williams. He was a tall man with an air of authority about him, the kind of person who seemed to assess every detail with a single glance. I learned he was the son of the woman I'd potentially be caring for, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny as he looked me over. His question came sharp and to the point, "So, you're Erin. Angela told me you'd be taking over. Do you have any experience with medical care? My mother has specific needs." I swallowed hard, feeling my throat go dry. But something inside me, maybe that same part that had been yearning for a chance to prove myself, pushed me to stand a little straighter. I heard myself reply, my voice steadier than I felt, "While I don't have professional experience, I've been caring for my grandparents and I have an intuition for understanding the needs of the elderly. I'm willing to learn whatever is necessary." Steve seemed to consider this for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my relief, he nodded. All right, let's give it a try, he said. He went on to tell me about his mother, Bonnie, how she loved to chat, read books, and walk in the garden. As he showed me down a long hallway, I couldn't help but marvel at the old wooden frames adorning the walls, each holding a portrait that seemed to whisper stories of past generations. It was like walking through a living history book, each step taking me deeper into a world I'd only ever imagined. We reached a pair of ornately carved wooden doors, and Steve gave a gentle knock before opening them. "Mom," he called out, "I'd like you to meet someone." And just like that, I was ushered into a spacious room, about to meet the woman who would change the course of my life in ways I could never have anticipated. As I stepped into that room, I was struck by how the sunlight streamed through the glass windows, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. It was like stepping into a painting, one of those scenes you might see in a Norman Rockwell piece, full of comfort and homey charm. There, in a large armchair, sat Bonnie, wrapped in a colorful blanket that reminded me of the quilts my grandmother used to make. She looked up from the book in her lap, her eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and kindness that immediately put me at ease. Her voice, when she spoke, was as soft and welcoming as a summer breeze, asking, "Oh, and who might this be?" I watched as Steve smiled, a rare sight, I'd come to learn, and introduced me as Aaron Jones, the new caregiver. He explained that Angela had to move and that I'd come on her recommendation. Then, with a gentle nudge, Steve turned to me, silently encouraging me to speak. I took a deep breath, stepping forward, acutely aware of the importance of this moment. It felt like I was auditioning for the most important role of my life, and in a way, I suppose I was. "It's an honor to meet you, Bonnie," I said, willing my voice not to shake. "I've heard so much about you, especially your love for the garden and books." I was trying to establish a connection, to find some common ground, like reaching out across a vast ocean to find a familiar shore. Bonnie set her book aside, leaning forward in her chair to get a better look at me. Her eyes, I noticed, were a clear blue, reminding me of forget-me-nots in spring. She seemed pleased that I knew about her hobbies, mentioning that Angela had told her I enjoyed caring for others. Then, with genuine interest, she asked about my own likes and hobbies. Her warmth was infectious, and I found myself relaxing a bit as I answered. "I love reading too," I said, feeling a smile spread across my face. "And when I can, I spend time with my family. We enjoy cooking together. I think there's no greater joy than time spent with loved ones." Bonnie nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "Oh, that's so true, dear," she agreed, and then, with a light chuckle that reminded me of wind chimes, she added, "And I hope you don't mind a lot of chatter. Angela might have mentioned that about me." Her laughter was like a key unlocking the last of my nervousness, and I felt the remaining formality melt away. Then, with a glint in her eye, she asked if I played chess or enjoyed card games. "I want to keep my mind sharp," she explained, "and it's wonderful to have someone to share these little pleasures with." By this point, I was feeling much more at ease, sensing a real connection forming between us. I eagerly replied that I knew a bit of chess and would be happy to learn other games. "I'm here to help and care for you," I told her, "and I'm really looking forward to learning." After that, our conversation flowed naturally, like a gentle stream finding its path. Before I knew it, we had built a rapport that felt as comfortable as a well-worn sweater. The next morning, I woke up early, a mix of anxiety and determination swirling in my stomach like a flock of butterflies. It was my first full day working at the Williams house, and I was desperate to make a good impression. I was out the door before the sun had fully risen, my mind going over a mental checklist as I made my way to Bonnie's house, hoping the day would go smoothly. When I arrived, I headed straight for the kitchen, determined to prepare a light, nutritious breakfast that I thought Bonnie might enjoy. I carefully arranged toast, some homemade strawberry jam, a bit of fresh cheese, and a pot of chamomile tea on a tray. I wanted Bonnie to feel cared for, to know that she was valued. Balancing the tray carefully in one hand, I made my way to Bonnie's room, pausing to knock gently before entering. I walked into Bonnie's room, my heart fluttering like a nervous bird, but I put on my warmest smile and said, "Good morning, Bonnie. Did you sleep well? I've brought you some breakfast." The sight of Bonnie, propped up on her pillows, her eyes lighting up when she saw me, made all my nervousness melt away like snow in spring sunshine. She greeted me with such warmth, calling me dear, that I felt like I was visiting a favorite aunt rather than caring for a patient. Bonnie seemed genuinely impressed that I'd already figured out her breakfast preferences, and she invited me to sit and eat with her, eager to know more about me. As I settled into the chair beside her bed, I felt a connection forming between us, like two knitters working on the same blanket. While Bonnie sipped her tea, I shared a little about my family, explaining how important it was to me to be able to help out at home. I could see understanding in her eyes, probably remembering her own days of juggling family responsibilities. I also expressed my keen interest in learning as much as I could to become the best caregiver possible. With all the sincerity I could muster, I told her, "I really want to do a good job. I'm willing to learn whatever is necessary to make sure you're always comfortable and happy." My words seemed to touch something in Bonnie. Her voice was soft and filled with gratitude when she responded, telling me she could see I had a good heart, and that was the most important thing. She assured me I'd learn everything else quickly, and expressed how glad she was that I had come. As we smiled at each other, I felt something shift. We were no longer just caregiver and patient, but two souls genuinely enjoying each other's company.
That afternoon, Steve Williams entered the living room. His mother, Bonnie, was reading a book, while Steve's face bore the worry of a long, tiring day. Steve barely noticed the room's details, the family portraits, or even his mother's efforts to look presentable for him. His phone was still in his hand, his eyes glued to the screen, checking new notifications. Bonnie looked at Steve with a mixture of hope and resignation, slowly closing her book and placing it on the table, attempting to start a conversation. She asked Steve how his day was, if he was tired, and invited him to sit and have coffee with her, expressing her desire to talk. Steve, momentarily setting aside his business concerns to share a quiet moment with her, let out a heavy sigh, clearly preoccupied. He told his mother that the day had been busy as usual, with many problems to solve and a challenging market. He glanced briefly at his mother, trying to hide his indifference, but quickly returned his attention to his phone screen. He added that he really didn't have much time to rest. Feeling the distance between them, Bonnie gently said she understood, but reminded him to take care of himself, noting that constantly being immersed in business wasn't healthy. She moved closer, trying to make eye contact and bring her son back to the present moment. Steve sensed his mother's efforts and made a gesture of agreement, though it wasn't genuine. He said, "Yeah, Mom. I'll try to slow down a bit." Yet his tone was automatic, his attention already on new messages. Steve Williams was a businessman consumed by his work, his thoughts rarely straying from company matters. Since taking over the family business, his life had become an endless series of meetings, strategic decisions, and business trips. Even in the rare moments at home, his mind was fixed on numbers, contracts, and expansion. The living room, meant to be a place of relaxation and time with his mother Bonnie, often transformed into an extension of his office, with papers scattered on the table and frequent phone calls. This focus on business left little room for Steve's personal life. He felt the growing distance from his mother, but in his balance of priorities, business almost always outweighed everything else. Steve strongly believed that professional success was the best way to honor his family and provide safety and financial stability. However, this view failed to recognize the emotional connection and presence that Bonnie valued so highly. Bonnie increasingly felt her son's absence and tried to initiate topics that might interest Steve. She hoped for moments of real connection to bring Steve back to the world outside of business. Patiently and with quiet hope, she often made his favorite dishes or brought up memories of family trips, trying to remind Steve of the value of spending time together.
I remember that beautiful, sunny day when Bonnie and I decided to take a stroll through the well-manicured garden surrounding the house. We walked slowly, savoring each step like we were tasting a fine wine. I offered my arm to Bonnie whenever she needed support, but mostly, I was there to keep her company and share in the stories that seemed to bloom around us like the flowers in the beds. As we walked, I noticed Bonnie seemed more pensive than usual. She let out a soft sigh as she gazed at the flower beds, beginning to burst with color, and I could almost see the memories flooding her eyes. Bonnie's voice was thick with nostalgia as she told me about Steve, her son. She said the garden reminded her of him, how he used to be out there all the time as a child, planting flowers and tending to them. Back then, she said, all she thought about was spending time with him. I listened carefully, watching the mix of sadness and love dance across Bonnie's face. It reminded me of my own mother, and how she used to look at old photo albums. I tried to comfort Bonnie, telling her that I was sure Steve still loved her very much. I suggested that even though his life at the company kept him busy, his love for her hadn't changed. But even as I said the words, I could feel Bonnie's complex emotions, as tangible as the warm sunlight on our skin. Bonnie stopped for a moment, looking at me with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and worry. Her words hit me like a gentle wave, full of understanding but tinged with sadness. She acknowledged my kindness, saying she knew Steve loved her. But then she added something that made my heart ache: love alone isn't always enough to keep people close. She confided that Steve always seemed distant, absorbed in his business. The worry in her voice was palpable as she expressed her fear that he was getting buried under his many responsibilities, forgetting about real life. I felt my heart constrict at her words, suddenly aware of the weight of loneliness Bonnie was carrying. It was a feeling I knew all too well from my own life, that sense of being left behind while the world rushed on. As I helped Bonnie to a nearby bench, I suggested that perhaps Steve just needed a gentle reminder of what truly mattered. I said he must feel lucky to have her here, hoping my words might offer some comfort. Bonnie took my hand then, her gaze deep and searching as she looked into my eyes. What she said next touched me deeply. She told me I reminded her of herself when she was young, always trying to see the best in people and help in any way I could. The gratitude in her voice was overwhelming, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Then she added something that left me speechless. She hoped that by me being there, Steve might start to see things the way I did. As we sat there, sharing that intimate moment, I felt both honored by Bonnie's trust and a little overwhelmed by it. It was dawning on me that my job wasn't just about caring for Bonnie's physical health. There were deeper, invisible wounds that needed healing too. In that moment, sitting in the sun-dappled garden with Bonnie, I realized that sometimes, the most important part of caregiving isn't what you do with your hands, but what you do with your heart.
Steve Williams arrived at his office early as usual, but this morning, the weight of the problems facing his company felt particularly heavy. As soon as he sat down, the phone started ringing and emails began flooding in, each bringing more bad news. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the tension rising. The company's major expansion project was facing serious regulatory hurdles, and key investors were threatening to withdraw financial support if the issues weren't resolved. Steve quickly glanced at the stack of papers on his desk, each representing a problem that needed his decision. "Why does everything have to happen at once?" he muttered to himself as he stood up and began pacing around the office, trying to organize his thoughts and priorities. His team was counting on his leadership, but at that moment, he felt more pressure than ever before. The phone rang again. It was the company's lawyer with an update on the legal challenges they were facing. The lawyer's voice was urgent as he explained that the situation was more complicated than expected, with authorities demanding more documentation and deadlines looming. Steve felt his stomach tighten as he responded, trying to maintain his composure, saying he would review everything again and see how they could expedite the process. After hanging up, Steve spent a long time staring into space. If they couldn't overcome this crisis, years of effort and investment might go to waste. He picked up the phone and called his team, summoning an emergency meeting. His voice was firm but tense as he told them he needed solutions, not excuses, and to gather in an hour. The meeting was intense, with Steve pressing for updates from each department and pushing for answers. He instructed them not to take no for an answer, to think smarter and move faster, to think outside the box. His mind was working overtime to find a way through the bureaucratic maze ahead of them. When the meeting ended, Steve remained alone in his office, feeling isolated and exhausted under the weight of responsibility. Steve Williams returned home with another commitment on his mind. He was invited to an important business dinner and planned to use his grandfather's old pocket watch, which he always carried for special occasions. He intended to use it as a token of good fortune and as a conversation piece. Steve searched for the watch in the drawer where he usually kept it, but it wasn't there. He checked other possible places, but still couldn't find it. The watch had simply vanished. His heart raced with frustration and a sense of loss as he called the loyal housekeeper who had worked for the family for years. Trying to keep his voice calm, he asked if she had seen his grandfather's watch, explaining that he needed it for that night. The housekeeper replied that she hadn't seen it and asked if she should help look for it. Steve knew the housekeeper would never touch personal items without permission, so he declined her offer, saying he would continue searching himself. He ended the call, feeling increasingly anxious and irritated with each passing minute. After checking again without success, Steve concluded that the only possibility was that someone in the house had stolen the watch. His thoughts turned to Erin, the recently hired caregiver. Steve decided to confront the new employee, suspecting that she might have taken the opportunity to steal, given her recent employment and lack of family ties.
I was in the kitchen, preparing tea for Bonnie, when Steve suddenly burst in like a thundercloud on a sunny day. His eyes were sharp, searching, as he asked me about an old pocket watch, something of great value that he couldn't find. I felt his gaze on me, probing for any sign of guilt, and it made my skin prickle with discomfort. Surprise and confusion washed over me like a cold wave, and I quickly assured him that I hadn't seen the watch and would never touch his personal belongings. My voice trembled slightly, betraying the shock I felt at his implicit accusation. It was like being slapped in the face by someone you thought you could trust. Steve's next words hit me like a hammer blow. He declared that he needed to resolve this immediately, that he couldn't live with uncertainty in his own home. Then came the words that made my world crumble. He told me to pack my things. The injustice of it all ignited a fire of indignation within me. I pleaded with Steve, my voice thick with emotion, trying to make him see reason. I assured him that I would never take something that wasn't mine, especially something so valuable. I argued that it was unfair to accuse me without any evidence. But Steve was like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The stress from work and the missing watch had wound him up tight, and he had no patience left for discussion or explanations. His words cut deep as he sneered at the idea of needing evidence. He pointed out that I was new, that things had gotten worse since I arrived. Then came the real kicker. He questioned my right to even speak about justice, dismissing me as just a caregiver with no special qualifications. Those words stung like salt in an open wound. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I was determined not to let them fall. I'd faced hardship before, worked my way up from nothing, and I wasn't about to let this man's baseless accusations break me. My voice remained steady, even as my heart raced and my hands shook. I told him that while I might not have any special qualities, I did have integrity. That wasn't something to be looked down upon, I said. Being humble didn't mean being dishonest, and accusing someone without evidence was wrong, no matter who they were or how much money they had. It reminded me of the times I'd seen good people judged unfairly just because they didn't have fancy titles or big bank accounts. Steve's face twisted with irritation at my defense. He couldn't control his temper, and his words dripped with contempt. He questioned whether I really thought my words carried any weight. To him, I was just a nobody, with no credentials to my name. Then came the final blow. He outright called me a thief. Those words hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. I realized there was nothing more I could say to change Steve's mind. My heart felt heavy, not just because of the unjust accusation, but because I could feel my hopes and dreams being crushed under the weight of unfair prejudice. It was like watching a lifetime of hard work go up in smoke. But I wasn't about to let him see me crumble. With all the strength I could muster, I looked him in the eye and declared, "I am not a thief." Those words carried all the conviction of my soul. I told him that one day the truth would come out, and his conscience would show him the error of his ways today. It was like throwing a pebble at a brick wall, but I had to try. Steve was done with the confrontation. He just pointed to the door and told me I was fired. He ordered me to pack my things and leave the house immediately. His final words left no room for argument. As I left the Williams house, my heart was torn and my dignity bruised. But even in that moment, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a new journey.
The morning after Aaron's dismissal, the Williams household woke to a heavy, somber atmosphere. Bonnie waited in the garden as usual, looking forward to starting her morning walk with Aaron. As the clock ticked on, Aaron's absence became increasingly apparent, and worry began to set in. Concerned, Bonnie went back into the house and found Steve in his office, surrounded by papers and phones. She interrupted him softly, asking if he had seen Aaron today. She expressed her worry, noting that it wasn't like Aaron to be late. Steve, without looking up, answered coldly and briefly. He told his mother that he had to fire Aaron yesterday. He explained that a very valuable watch had disappeared, and everything pointed to Aaron taking it. He stated that they couldn't keep untrustworthy people in their home. Bonnie felt the shock and sadness hit her like a physical blow, stunned by the words she could hardly believe. She protested, insisting that it couldn't be true. She defended Aaron, describing her as a good person who was always very careful and honest. Bonnie's voice trembled slightly with emotion as she expressed her certainty that there must be some mistake. Steve, clearly irritated by his mother's persistent questioning, finally looked up with a stern expression. He firmly told his mother that there was no mistake and that the evidence was clear. He said they couldn't risk their family's safety and informed her that he had hired another caregiver starting today. He asked her not to dwell on this matter any further. Bonnie recoiled, feeling the weight of her son's words. Bonnie knew she had no power to change Steve's decision, but her heart was heavy not only with the loss of a beloved companion but also with the sense of injustice Aaron was experiencing. She told Steve that her heart was telling her something was wrong. Steve didn't respond, returning to his papers, and Bonnie left the room. With a heavy heart, the silence in the house after Steve left for work felt deeper and sadder than usual. Still unable to accept Aaron's situation, Bonnie decided to take action herself. Guided by intuition and hope, she headed to Steve's room. She slowly searched the room, checking places where Steve might have absent-mindedly placed the watch, moving items on the nightstand with shaking hands to get a better view. Suddenly, she heard a faint metallic sound, and as she carefully moved the furniture, she saw a golden glint hidden in the shadow behind the nightstand. It was the pocket watch, fallen and forgotten in a place Steve surely hadn't looked. With her heart racing, feeling a mix of relief and anger towards Steve, Bonnie picked up the phone and called Steve's office, but it went straight to voicemail. She left a brief, clear message explaining her discovery and asking him to come back as soon as possible to discuss the matter. The afternoon passed slowly, and Bonnie's anxiety only grew. When Steve returned home in the evening, she immediately confronted him, showing him the watch she had found. She told Steve to look, explaining that she had found it behind the nightstand, that the watch had been in the house all along, and that Aaron had been unjustly accused. Her voice was firm as she held out the watch as evidence. Steve took the watch from her hand, examining it with a mask of frustration and defensiveness on his face. For a moment, his expression softened as if about to admit his error, but pride quickly reasserted itself. He said that the watch had been found and that was what mattered, attempting to end the conversation while avoiding his mother's gaze. Bonnie felt a painful disappointment as she watched Steve refuse to acknowledge his mistake and rectify the damage done to Aaron. Bonnie pleaded with Steve, saying it wasn't just about the watch. She pointed out that he had unjustly accused the girl and asked if he shouldn't at least correct that and apologize. She appealed to him, hoping his conscience would be stirred by the injustice, but Steve remained stubbornly in place. His pride wouldn't allow him to go beyond the facts. Steve told his mother that he had made his decision and wasn't going to retract it. He emphasized the importance of maintaining order and authority. His tone indicated the end of the conversation, leaving no room for further discussion. The decision had been made, and as painful as it was, Bonnie knew there was nothing more she could do to change her son's mind. Steve was the kind of person who, even when faced with an obvious mistake, chose pride over regret. Bonnie held the phone with trembling hands, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She had found Aaron's number written on a small piece of paper that Aaron had left behind in the house. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number, feeling the ringing echo her own nervousness.
When I answered the phone, Bonnie's voice was filled with emotion. My heart skipped a beat when I heard her voice on the other end of the line. She was calling to apologize, her words tumbling out in a rush of sincerity that nearly took my breath away. The watch had been found, she told me, right there in the house all along, behind Steve's nightstand. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed quickly by a tinge of bitterness. I hadn't expected to hear from her, and her apology, while welcome, was a bittersweet reminder of what I'd lost. I told her I accepted her apology, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I admitted how much I had enjoyed working with her, and how sad I was that things had turned out this way. As I spoke, I could almost see Bonnie's kind face, her eyes brimming with tears. She told me how much she missed me, her voice thick with emotion. It was like a balm to my wounded spirit, soothing yet painful at the same time. She spoke of Steve, her love for him evident even as she acknowledged his unfairness towards me. I could hear the sadness in her voice as she mentioned trying to talk to him, knowing full well how proud he could be. I sighed, feeling a mix of understanding and resignation. I told her I understood, knowing it wasn't easy for her either. I reflected on all I had learned during my time with her, moments I would always cherish. There was a part of me that hoped Steve would one day realize he needed to change how he treated people. No one deserves to be accused without just cause, I said, feeling the weight of my own experience. Bonnie's response touched me deeply. She wished me the best, hoping I'd find happiness wherever I went. Her words were like a warm embrace, reminding me of the grandmother I'd lost years ago. As we said our goodbyes, I promised to keep her in my thoughts with respect and affection. Even as I hung up the phone, feeling the finality of our parting, I knew that this conversation, painful as it was also a kind of closure. After that conversation with Bonnie, I felt a mix of relief and bitterness. The exchange left a lasting impact on me, and I found myself hoping that someday, justice and understanding would triumph over pride and hasty judgments. I sat at my small dining table at home, surrounded by my usual simple surroundings, but now the space felt confining. It was as if the walls were closing in, reminding me of the injustice I'd faced. I understood my humble origins, but I also knew that my honesty and integrity were my greatest strengths. The humiliation of being unfairly accused had ignited a fierce desire for justice within me. I made a decision right then and there, speaking it aloud to the empty room. If no one will fight for us, then I'll do it myself. The idea of becoming a lawyer started as a whisper in my mind, but quickly grew into a concrete plan. I began researching law careers and studying for the entrance exams at night. After long, grueling days at work, I'd buy secondhand textbooks and spend hours absorbing information about laws and rights. Often, I'd sacrifice sleep to study, feeling like a night owl with a mission. When the day of the entrance exam arrived, I headed to the test center with a mix of nerves and excitement coursing through my veins. Pen in hand and dreams in my heart, I took the test, time passing in a blur of concentration and determination. After the exam, I felt I'd given it my all, like a marathon runner crossing the finish line. Weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. I held it with trembling hands, tears of joy and relief streaming down my cheeks. I did it, I whispered, allowing myself a moment to celebrate before preparing for the new journey of study and challenges ahead. This early success was just the first step in my newfound resolve to never accept injustice without a fight. I graduated from law school with honors, gaining not just an understanding of the law but also specializing in labor law due to my past unfair experiences. I knew my mission was to help people facing workplace abuse and inequality, to be a voice for those who, like me, needed someone to stand up for their rights. Right after graduation, I started working at a prestigious law firm dedicated to labor issues. My commitment and passion quickly stood out among my colleagues and clients. I didn't just provide technical knowledge, I had a deep empathy and understanding for my clients' struggles. That's what made me an exceptional lawyer. I'd walked in their shoes, felt their pain, and was determined to fight for them with every fiber of my being. My reputation for going above and beyond in achieving goals quickly spread beyond the law firm. I found myself frequently invited to speak at seminars on labor law, where I shared not just my legal expertise, but also my personal beliefs about justice in the workplace. I remember one particular event where, as I prepared to take the stage, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement buzzing through me like electricity. As I walked to the podium, I could feel the eyes of the audience following me, reminding me of my first day in court. I began my lecture by discussing a recent case we'd won, a significant victory for workers facing discrimination in their workplace. The law, I said, my voice ringing clear in the hall, is more than just text in old books. It's a living tool for justice, meant to protect those who don't have a voice. Another time, I was invited to speak at an event for business executives about workplace well-being. I stepped onto the stage with confidence born from countless speeches, knowing how to capture an audience's attention like a seasoned performer. I projected my first slide, highlighting the correlation between employee well-being and company productivity. Now, I know talking about productivity is par for the course at these events, I said, my voice strong and clear. But I want you to understand that the productivity we seek in our companies starts with respecting and valuing each worker. Studies show that employees who feel valued aren't just more productive, they innovate and grow with the company. As I turned to change the slide, my eyes caught a familiar face in the crowd. My heart did a somersault. It was Steve Williams. He was staring at me with a mix of surprise and discomfort, like someone who'd stumbled upon an old, forgotten photograph. For a moment, I lost the thread of my speech. The memory of the humiliation I'd suffered years ago at Steve's command came flooding back, overwhelming me like a tidal wave. The audience, sensing the sudden silence, began to whisper. I saw Steve lower his gaze, seeming to realize the disturbance his presence had caused. In that moment, I understood that regardless of his past actions, my accomplishments stood as a testament against the injustice he'd done. It felt like an eternity, but after a few seconds, I found my voice again. I apologize for the pause, ladies and gentlemen, I said, regaining my composure. Sometimes, the past brings unexpected memories. But it's these personal challenges that drive us to seek justice and fairness. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone in every workplace. I took a deep breath and decided to share my story, the reason I was standing there, and why I had dedicated my life to labor law. My voice was filled with unwavering determination as I began. A few years ago, I was a young caregiver working in a home where I thought I had built a relationship of trust and mutual respect. The audience was listening in complete silence. You could have heard a pin drop. One day, a valuable item went missing, and in that instant, without any investigation or evidence, I was unjustly fired for theft. I could feel the weight of that moment as I spoke, the humiliation and injustice of that day still palpable after all these years. I protested that there was no evidence against me, but my employer wouldn't listen to my side or conduct a proper investigation. The bitterness of that memory coated my words as I continued. I was dismissed based on unfounded accusations. I paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Ironically, the item I was accused of stealing was found shortly after, right where it had disappeared from. I could see the shock registering on people's faces as I revealed. Even more ironic was that the person who accused me, despite having the power and authority to change the situation, never retracted their accusation. The injustice of it all came flooding back as I said, this person clearly didn't act with justice, didn't try to correct their mistake, and never apologized. I took a breath, allowing my story to resonate with the audience. But I chose not to harbor resentment. Holding on to anger only keeps you trapped in the past. Instead, I chose to move forward. My voice softened as I shared, in a way, that painful experience was a gift. It gave me the resolve to change the course of my life. With renewed vigor, I declared, I decided to study law and become an attorney fighting for justice and fairness. I continued, acknowledging the different paths I could have taken. I could have been crushed by that experience or resigned myself to being a victim of circumstances. But there was steel in my voice as I said, however, something inside me refused to accept that as the end of my story. I shared my determination. I set out not just to study law and pass the bar, but to gain a deep understanding of how to be a voice for the voiceless. Pride filled my words as I said, as a lawyer, I've fought for people who were unfairly dismissed, who faced discrimination in the workplace. I felt a surge of emotion as I concluded, what sustains me is the impact I've made and the faces of each person I've helped. My voice rang with conviction as I said, it reinforces my belief that the fight for justice is never in vain. I ended my speech with a lesson learned. My journey has taught me valuable lessons. It's possible to turn adversity into opportunity, and most importantly, justice itself becomes the driving force to fight for it in the world. As I finished, the room erupted in applause. I noticed Steve Williams standing too, his face a mix of discomfort and reflection. As the applause continued, Steve seemed to be confronting his past mistakes. As the applause died down and people began to disperse, I stepped off the stage and mingled with those who came to express their gratitude and admiration. Many shared brief stories of injustices similar to what I had faced, their words echoing my own experiences like a chorus of shared pain. Suddenly, in an unexpected moment, Steve approached me. He began to speak, his voice heavy with a deep sigh that seemed to come from years of regret. Steve told me he had something to say, that my words today had made him deeply reflect on the past and what had transpired between us. As he spoke, his eyes searched mine, looking for any sign of acceptance, like a child seeking forgiveness after a grave mistake. He admitted that what he had done was unjust and reckless, and he was truly sorry. I gazed at him for a moment, carefully weighing his words. I could see the anxiety in him and the difficulty he was having in acknowledging his error. It reminded me of my own struggles with admitting mistakes, a universal human experience. My voice was calm as I responded, each word carefully chosen like stepping stones across a turbulent river. I told Steve that I accepted his apology and that it meant a great deal to me. I acknowledged that the situation had been difficult, but I had learned a lot, both professionally and emotionally. It was like looking back on a storm that had shaped the landscape of my life. I explained that I had learned much from that experience, that it had helped me grow and find my true calling. My fight for justice, I told him, wasn't just for me but for all those without a voice. His apology today, I said, was closing a chapter in my life, one I had already begun to move past. Steve listened intently, his face a map of emotions. He confessed that he hadn't expected my forgiveness, his voice low and humble. He hoped his words could at least show a path towards redemption, even if they couldn't change the past. I felt a small smile form on my lips, acknowledging his effort. I told him that forgiveness isn't forgetting, but choosing not to carry the burden of anger. I had chosen to move forward, I said, because holding on to resentment helps no one. I expressed my hope that he too would move forward and truly learn from this experience. Steve's face showed clear relief at my response, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He thanked me, expressing deep respect for my generous spirit and promising to keep this lesson in his heart. As he left with a respectful nod, I took a moment to reflect on my own thoughts and feelings. I felt a heaviness in my heart, but also a sense of lightness, as if a burden had been lifted. This interaction made me realize just how challenging my journey had been. Every experience had contributed to my strength and resilience, like a sword forged in fire. Forgiving Steve wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about affirming my own growth and ability to overcome adversity.
That night, when Steve returned home, he was filled with a complex mix of relief and reflection. His encounter with Erin had stirred up emotions and thoughts he never expected to face. He felt an urgent need to share his experience with someone who would understand, and he knew that person was his mother, Bonnie. Bonnie was reading in her room when she heard Steve come home. She sensed his mood from his footsteps and felt that something was different about this night. As soon as Steve appeared at her door, she asked him how it went. Steve sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his mother with a serious and reflective expression. He told her he had something important to share about his day. He explained that Erin, the caregiver he had unjustly accused years ago, was there today and had become a lawyer. Bonnie's eyes widened in surprise and curiosity. She exclaimed, wondering about Erin, the young caregiver, and asked Steve how it went. Steve took a deep breath and continued. He shared that Erin had given a speech about justice and her journey to becoming a lawyer. He then admitted that he had apologized to her for everything he had caused. As he spoke, he stared at his hands, still grappling with the weight of his words. Bonnie took her son's hands in hers, her face showing a mix of pride and relief. She expressed how proud she was of Steve, acknowledging the great courage it takes to admit mistakes and apologize. She was glad he had done it and noted how Erin had become an amazing woman, overcoming many difficulties to succeed. Steve agreed, sharing that Erin had accepted his apology. He said it had made him think about how much he still had to learn, both as an entrepreneur and as a person. As he shared his feelings with his mother, Steve felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Bonnie smiled and caressed her son's face. She reminded him that everyone is always learning, and what's important is to keep an open heart and be willing to change. She expressed her hope that Steve would find his path, just as Erin had found hers. Steve listened quietly to his mother's words, lost in thought for a moment of silence. Later that night, after talking with his mother, Steve sat in his living room. Reflecting on the changes needed in his life and work, Steve recognized that to truly honor the apology he had made to Erin, significant changes were necessary. First, he reflected on his company's culture. Steve had always prioritized profit and efficiency, often at the expense of employee well-being. Muttering that this needed to change, he took out a notebook and began planning. He wrote down that employees are the heart of the company, and if they thrive, so does the company. This meant investing more in training, providing better benefits, and creating a more welcoming and inclusive work environment. Next, Steve considered his leadership style. Aaron's speech had made him realize that his authoritarian approach was intimidating, hindering the acceptance of valuable ideas and stifling innovation. He decided he needed to be more accessible and open to comments, resolving to establish more effective and regular communication channels with employees at all levels. Finally, he planned a meeting with his leadership team for the next morning to share his new perspective and discuss the planned changes. Steve was determined to make this meeting the first step towards a new era for the company, one of transparency, fairness, and mutual growth.
I continued to build my career with passion, becoming a respected and influential figure in labor law. Each victory in important cases not only strengthened my reputation but also reaffirmed my belief in the power of law as a tool for social justice. It was like watching a garden I'd planted finally bloom, each success a vibrant flower in the landscape of my career. Despite my success, I never forgot what had driven me to choose this path. The memory of my difficult beginnings and the injustice I'd faced was like a flame that continued to burn within me, inspiring me to help others turn adversity into success. I felt a deep calling, as strong as a mother's instinct to protect her child, to support young people who wanted to study law but were disadvantaged for economic or social reasons. So, I decided to start a project, a nonprofit organization I named Law for All. It was my way of paying forward the chance I'd been given, like passing on a torch of hope and opportunity. We provided scholarships, mentoring, and educational resources. I shared my personal story with the students, encouraging them to pursue their dreams regardless of their background or the challenges they faced. It reminded me of my own journey, and how a single act of kindness or support can change the course of someone's life. During my visits to schools and community centers, I would tell the students, each one of you can be an agent of change. I wanted them to understand that the law is a powerful tool for creating a fairer world, just as I had discovered in my own life. The impact of the project was immediate and profound. Thanks to our support, many students were able to step into the world of law. Watching them enter law school and begin to make changes in their communities filled me with a pride as deep as any I'd felt in my own accomplishments. It was like watching my own children succeed, each of their victories a personal joy. At a fundraising event for the project, I found myself reflecting, the young people who've studied here prove that when you give the right tools to the right people, the impossible becomes possible. It was a testament to how far we'd come and how much further we could go. From a victim of injustice to an advocate for justice, I had transformed each challenge into an opportunity for growth and a chance to help others grow.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd be grateful if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share wonderful stories like this one every day. Don't miss the next amazing tale that will appear on your screen shortly. We deeply appreciate your support and engagement with our content. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon for more inspiring stories.